What's up, guys? Welcome to Stat Chasing Week 2. If you haven't watched before, this is just my process of kind of going through some stats that I think are important, help me get kind of a foundation for the week ahead, help me, I think, better absorb the information that everyone else is putting out there. So some of the stats that I'm looking at are yards per route run from PFF. In particular, I like looking at that for wide receivers, but especially for tight ends, seeing how many targets a tight end is getting per the amount of routes they're running is something that really popped in the research that I was doing in the offseason for tight ends. I also like to look at expected points, which is a metric that RotoViz has. It's something I didn't talk about so much last week, but it is something that I look at, helped me get on Aaron Jones and DFS this past week. And it weights opportunities by the line of scrimmage. And I think that's helpful, particularly with these split backfields and helping us identify the guys who are still getting a lot of valuable touches and a lot of valuable opportunities, even if they may not have total control of their backfields. And then the other thing that I really like to look at is air yards and target share and Josh Hermsmeyer's metric Whopper, which combines target share and share of air yards weighted towards targets. I believe I'll mention Racer in this, which is another Josh Hermsmeyer metric that looks at yards after catch and catch rate. And then I'll refer to the 10-yard line and in the way Ben Gretsch does, which is calling it the green zone. So that's what I mean. The guy got a carry within the 10-yard line. It's a green zone carry. Starting with Arizona, Kenyon Drake had a big edge on Chase Edmonds this week in expected value. That was not the case in week 1. They were basically tied. But in week 2, his workload was a lot more valuable. Drake did underperform that workload, but I think he could be in for a nice game going forward. There's some red flags here still. Chase Edmonds got 3 targets to Drake's 2. Edmonds also ran 20 routes. So that could be a little bit of a value suck. And this is definitely a split backfield, but Drake got the only high value carry this week. And I think, he could be someone that pops a little bit moving forward, although definitely more of a split than we would have liked to see, especially anyone taking him in that late first round range. But yeah, he's definitely could deliver some value at some point. Deandre Hopkins led the team in routes and targets. This is one of the most interesting things I found this week. His ADOT in week 1 was 6.4, right? Super shallow. That declined in week 2 to just 4.1. So we look at the fact that he has 140 air yards this season on that small of an ADOT, that shallow of an ADOT is going to tell you that he's just been a huge factor in terms of getting a bunch of targets. He does have a 36% air yard share, or rather a 36% target share so far. On the flip side, Christian Kirk, his ADOT in week 1 was 14. That's really deep. That increased in week 2 to 27.5, just like an insane deep threat. Something you normally don't see. This is both guys are probably, gonna come closer over the course of the season, but almost certainly really. But they are playing completely different roles in this offense. You've got Hopkins running a very high volume role underneath and Christian Kirk doing a lot of clear out routes, basically. You're also seeing that from Andy Isabella. He's run only 20 routes through 2 games. He has a 3.35 yards per route run, but he's operating even deeper downfield on average than Kirk. His targets come at 29 yards downfield on average. So really interesting offensive design here where you've got Kyler Murray with the rushing ability. You've got Nuke with, he's their best wide receiver and they're throwing to him super shallow. So I'm kind of wondering, are they sort of going to force defenses to play them more underneath? If they do, then they could have some huge explosive games ahead of them with Isabella and Kirk getting behind people. The running game hasn't been as efficient this year, but it was really efficient last year, which is, another way they can kind of lure defenses up close. So I don't know, maybe I'm getting too football guy here, but it's kind of interesting the way that they have Kirk and Isabella in such a different role than their number 1 wide receiver. Dan Arnold is a guy I think we can safely ignore, just a target on 8% of his routes so far. In Atlanta, Todd Gurley ran just 20 routes, wasn't targeted. Through 2 games, he has 1 yard on 34 routes. Brian Hill leads the running backs in targets with 4 on 22 routes. Ito Smith has 3 targets on 23 routes. This is not a valuable receiving pie, and they're splitting it 3 ways. It's really gross. Ito Smith had 2 carries inside the 10 in this game. No one else had any. Last week, you had Todd Gurley saving his week with a touchdown. Didn't even get the chance to do that this week. Went to Ito Smith instead. So this backfield is definitely one to avoid. Wide receiver, Calvin Ridley, again led the Falcons in routes with 38. He led the team with 28% of targets and 45% of air yards. Definitely looking like a co-wide receiver 1 in this offense at worst. Russell Gage ran nearly a full slate of routes again with 34. He also drew 12 targets. He had 25% of the targets and 15% of the air yards, a shallower wide receiver. Hurst emerged, as I'll get to, but Gage has continued to be heavily involved in the offense. Julio Jones only has an 18% target share through 2 weeks. He does have 30% of the air yards, which leads the team. This because he's operating on average, his ADOT is 16.4. ADOT is average depth of target. And he did drop a touchdown this week. If he did not, he would have had a much, much better game. And that's kind of like, if you saw the play, sort of a trick play, deep throw, and that's kind of what you're going to see with him is a little bit of variance, these huge swings on a couple plays. When you're operating with an ADOT of 16.4, that's just kind of the way it's going to go. I would like to see, I have Julio in an important league. I'd like to see that ADOT come down a little bit so he's a little bit more consistent. Right now, it looks like Ridley is going to be the guy who's like the most reliable option as a fantasy starter in this offense. Hayden Hurst bounced back pretty nicely from a poor week 1. He had a 21% targets per route run and a 10.3 yards per target. Both those are really good. I was not on Hurst coming into the season. Week 1 made me feel like I was right not to be. Week 2 has me wondering if, maybe I should have given Hurst a little bit more credit for the season that he had last year, given that he was a second-year player. The research that I did pointed me to saying, actually what Hurst showed as a second-year player is in line with some of the breakouts that we've seen from third-year tight ends. That being said, he's changing teams. He's entering this role that Austin Hooper didn't actually get targeted at a high rate in. And so you could see Hurst struggling to get those targets. Now I'm a little bit thinking, I'm still leaning towards, being glad I'm off of Hurst, but this week definitely was bullish for Hurst. In Baltimore, J.K. Dobbins led the backfield in expected points in week 1, had that big game, but Mark Ingram was far ahead of him in week 2. And then I think more concerningly, Gus Edwards was involved as well. He's stealing, a little bit of that value, that round 6 expected points, and making this backfield a little bit messy for the time being. Marquis Brown got only 28 routes in week 2. Last week, he had this insane efficiency. Didn't get that this week. He wasn't bad, but when he's operating on low volume, you're going to need that for him to really pay off on those weeks. Houston, I think, just seems like a team that's going to be losing a lot of games and also kind of ruining a lot of fantasy matchups. They don't seem like they're going to be fun to be having your passing offense go again this season, just based on those first couple matchups. Hopefully that doesn't end up being the case, but Miles Boykin is kind of quietly making me happy that I have a lot of him in best ball, because he's running a lot of routes and his yards per route run is solid, 1.52. That's not bad. If this offense is forced to throw a little bit more, I think he could have some really nice spike weeks. He does look like the third guy in the air yards distribution here. Mark Andrews also had a bit of a down game. Not a bit. He had a true down game. 14% targets per route run. Only 1 catch for 29 yards. 14% targets per route run is really low, way lower. I mean, Andrews had the highest target per route run of any tight end in the PFF database going back 2006 last year, around just over 30%. So to see him down at 14% this week is definitely disappointing. He had a nice healthy one above 20% last week. I'm also a little concerned, though, because he only ran a route on 66% of his dropbacks, which was something that we also saw last year where he wasn't running a full slate of routes. He did run a lot of routes in week 1, It's a little concerning to see him fall back again in week 2 here. He did get 101 air yards, so it wasn't like it was all bad. And he was also targeted in the end zone. But, definitely a bad week for Andrews. Hopefully he bounces back quickly. In Buffalo, Devon Singletary had 3 targets on 16 routes. Moss ran 13 routes but wasn't targeted. He was a little bit banged up in this one. I don't know if that contributed there. Singletary continues to maintain an edge in the passing game. Definitely getting the targets here, and he had a slight edge last week. He also had the only running back rush inside the 10-yard line, so definitely a bit of a down week for Moss. Singletary rebounding after it looked like maybe Moss could become the 1A in this backfield. Singletary fighting back a little bit. I still think Moss could be the 1A down the line, but Singletary is going to make it a little bit more difficult than it looked like it might be after week 1. Stefan Diggs ran 6 less routes than John Brown, but Diggs dominated targets. He had a target on 45% of his routes, which is just absurd. His yards per route run was 5.28, which is like metric breaking. 37% target share, 40% air yard share. His Whopper of 0.84 was the second highest on the week. Just an absolute monster game from Diggs. And then John Brown comes in with still a healthy Whopper of 0.53. Not a guy you should forget about. That 0.53 through 2 weeks. The passing game's pretty condensed here. You're not really getting anything from the tight end. You're not getting a ton from the other wide receivers. So Diggs and Brown can eat here. And I also think that Diggs, he's showing that he's a truly elite wide receiver. And I think he's raising the ceiling of this entire offense so that Brown can be pretty much what he was last year. Maybe, he's losing a little bit of that value, but Diggs is creating a ceiling for Josh Allen that wasn't there before and actually increasing the pie of this offense. And, I think that's part of the reason we tend to be so big on wide receivers, both in redraft and in dynasty. It's like these wide receivers, their talent actually, one, tends to shine through a little bit more in terms of their outcomes in the NFL. But two, I think they actually make more of an impact on the field. And so it wasn't just a matter of, are there enough targets here for Diggs? Diggs can create those targets by being awesome. And I think hopefully that is what is happening and will continue to happen here. Gabriel Davis, you say that there's not that many interesting wide receivers. Davis is pretty interesting from a dynasty perspective. He ran 17 routes after just 22 routes, or after 22 routes last week, which was pretty good for a rookie. Got just 1 target this week, but this beautiful touchdown catch. I'm sure you've seen it. He also got a rush inside the 10-yard line. He's someone that I'm really happy to have some shares of if John Brown ends up falling off or he's a cut candidate after the season. So if he were to fall off and they cut him, or he comes back, but then Davis has a stellar camp next year. You could be looking at Davis as the wide receiver 2 in this offense in 2021. Dawson Knox ran 11 routes after having just an 11% targets per route run last week. Through 2 weeks, he's getting targeted on 16% of his routes, which is pretty bad. He's only running a route on 42% of dropbacks. So those two combined make him someone you can ignore really in all formats. I guess in like tight end premium dynasty, he should be owned. In Carolina, Christian McCaffrey, 4 to 6 weeks. This is a bummer. I think Mike Davis, as I sit here and I'm recording this after the Monday Night Football game, so I still have some more thinking on this to do, but right now I'm leaning towards prioritizing Mike Davis over the Giants guys, and I'm open to the idea of going fairly hard on Davis because he did seem to be operating as like the clear workhorse back with McCaffrey out, and pretty involved as a receiver too, which is obviously hugely important. So you're getting a shorter span of Davis, but with these bids, like you're so often not really getting much, from these. It still matters to me the profile of these running backs that we're getting off the waiver, where I think like we could end up getting like a worse version of James Robinson with Wayne Gallman or whatever. So I'm leaning towards prioritizing Davis. I think he might be slightly cheaper in some leagues. Maybe not. Maybe he'll be the most expensive guy, but he just seems like more likely to pay off on that big fab drop. And those high ankle sprains, it's not great for McCaffrey. That could linger. DJ Moore, man, he had an awesome week this week. Tremendous bounce back performance, 32% of targets, 55% of air yards. His Whopper of 0.87 was the highest on the week. It's the only guy who beat Diggs. He had a yards per out run of 2.73, so he's efficient on this giant workload. He ran a route on 94% of dropbacks. I think if the matchup improves and he can maybe have that like really, really spiked efficiency on this type of role, like he could just have some huge weeks in the future. And this wasn't an ideal matchup against Tampa Bay. So I'm really excited about DJ Moore, especially since he kind of had that a little bit shaky week one. But I do think there was some signal in week one with Robbie Anderson because he used this week to really put some big distance between him and Curtis Samuel. Anderson had 25% target share to Samuel's 5% and 31% air yard share to Samuel's 3%. So it's pretty clear that Anderson has pulled ahead of Samuel here for the secondary role in this offense, but I do think it's a secondary role with the week we just saw to Moore. And then when you look behind Samuel, Ian Thomas ran 30 routes but was not targeted. Chris Manhertz saw 1 target on 8 routes. I keep mentioning Manhertz because I do think he probably is going to be the starting tight end in this offense by the end of the year. But, I mean, it's like deep tight end premium dynasty type stuff. I don't know if he'll actually be worth anything even in the FFPC, but worth keeping an eye on the situation. But, yeah, I mean, the big takeaway for the time being is that the target share is going to condense here or has condensed to the running back, Moore, and Anderson. And I think all of those are going to be pretty strong plays. In Chicago, David Montgomery ran 15 routes after running 14 last week. Tariq Cohen dropped from 18 to 14. And then Montgomery led in targets. So this is bad for Cohen. He obviously has capped contingent value. Like we were talking about Ryan Nall when we thought Montgomery was going to miss games. Cohen is not going to be a workhorse back. And now he doesn't even have standalone value. I think he's droppable right now in medium depth leagues. I think he's about a week, maybe 2 away from being droppable in high stakes leagues. I mean, maybe that's aggressive, but I don't know. You're not getting any standalone value from him. And then it's like, what has to happen for, I mean, sure, if Montgomery were to miss a bunch of weeks, then Cohen would become startable, but it's not like he'd be this, you wouldn't be like doing backflips to have him in your lineup. So not a good start for Tariq Cohen. Allen Robinson, he had a down week in production, but he still had an elite 33% target share and 36% air yard share. I think he's definitely going to be a little bit frustrating this year, but there are going to be some strong weeks for him in 2020, assuming health and all that. He just has too big a role, but I think a little bit unpredictable. Anthony Miller, he dropped to 0 this week. He only ran around on 51% of dropbacks. This Evan Silva turned me on to this in his matchup column. He pointed this out of the fact that he's just a slot role and they're running a lot of 2 tight end sets. And through 2 weeks, 49 of his 53 snaps have come in the slot this season, which I think is why Miller is just having this part-time role. It's interesting that they're not using Miller at all on the outside. Instead, they're using Darnell Mooney, who's this little rookie. He's at he ran a 4.38, but at 5'11", 174. He ran a route on 64% of dropbacks. He's definitely an interesting name, more for Dynasty, probably better in best ball. Jimmy Graham continues to play way ahead of Cole Kmet, but Graham was targeted just once on 24 routes. And this week for the season, he's earning targets on just 13% of his routes. His yards per target is 6.1. These are bad numbers, and they are leaving the door open for Kmet. Graham was like the star of Bears camp, which I don't know. Maybe he had a great camp, or maybe these guys can't evaluate talent. It's not a good look when Graham's the star of your camp and then he goes out and does this. But, I've got some skin in the game here. I like Kmet a lot. I was on him as a prospect. I have him in some dynasty leagues, and I'd really like to see him get a bigger chance. I did manage to hold him in a FFPC dynasty where he's pretty near my cut line. I cut Asiasi instead, but trying to get Kmet here, through on my rosters, and hopefully he'll, keep him on my rosters until Graham goes away. Because I do think Graham is ultimately going to be a placeholder here. He's performing like that. In Cincinnati, Mixon ran 27 routes, up 10 from last week, but he ran just under 40%. I ran a route on just 40% of dropbacks, just under in both weeks. So he saw 4 targets in week 2, up from 1 last week. That's the good news. But yeah, still not running routes on a bunch of dropbacks. Gio Bernard saw his routes spike. He ran a route on 44% of dropbacks this week after just 25% in week 1. And I don't think that this is good news for Mixon because of the way the game script went. The Bengals are playing catch up, and then that's when Bernard sees his percentage of routes run spike, showing that he's going to be more involved in that type of scenario. I don't think it kills Mixon's value in negative game script because he was still involved in passing game, more involved in the passing game than he had been before. So he can benefit a little bit, but I do think it kind of just shows that he does have, I think, some capped upside, and that unlike an Ezekiel Elliott or, a healthy Christian McCaffrey or some of these other true workhorse backs, he's a little bit game script dependent and going to be much better off in games where the Bengals are leading. At wide receiver, AJ Green, again, only ran a partial slate of routes, 66% this week. He had 68% last week. He was the clear alpha again, 22% target share, 42% of air yards. He's currently 12th in the NFL in Whopper, so he has this really big role. He's been super inefficient. This past week was crazy inefficient. And yeah, he's got a racer. Again, that's that catch rate and yards after catch combo metric of 0.24, which is real bad. Yards per target of 3.6, which is just comically bad. So there's been some debate, right? Is he a buy low? I think he is a buy low. And the reason I think that, I do think that he could be done. I mean, he's coming off injury. He's an older player. He could just be washed up. But he's also running his routes. His ADOT is 15.4. So he's kind of a deep threat, and he's getting a ton of volume. There's a lot of upside there. If he connects on a few big plays, you're getting that many chances, and you're running that far downfield on average. I mean, that does create a ton of upside. It also creates a lot of variance. And so you can see that maybe he's just run bad and he isn't washed. And if that's the case, then we really are at serious risk if we start just pretending that this guy's done when he's just had a couple bad games. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to proceed with caution a little bit in terms of just completely fading him, and just recognize that I think he does have a lot of upside just given how big his role is. The other thing is that, do we want to get too caught up in the per target efficiency, right? Because Racer looks at catch rate and it looks at yards after catch. So those things are after you've been targeted. Yards per target looks at how many yards you have after you got a target. There is another component here, and this is a lot of the stuff that I've been looking at this offseason, of the idea of actually targets themselves are a skill. Getting those targets are a skill. It's not just volume. It's not just like a handoff deep downfield. You had to get open. You had to do something to earn that target from your quarterback. He made a decision that you were the correct way to make that play. And Green is earning targets on 29% of his routes. That's elite. And that target per route run is what we see. The reason that yards per route run is sticky, Ben Gretsch ran these numbers, it's because the targets per route run is sticky. It's interesting. Yards per route run is less sticky than targets per route run because you add this noise filter of yards per target on top, which is not sticky year to year. I think there's some, it's important, I think, to some degree to know what the yards per target is, because it does seem to factor into like coaching decisions and stuff down the line. They don't want to be putting out guys who just can't play. But for the most part, you want to be paying attention to the targets per route run. And there is a signal here. I mean, there's all this small sample size stuff. We don't know for sure, but there's at least a reason to think that Green is playing at a high level, that he's earning targets at a really high level. And, maybe he's just washed. But I think I'm going to stick with Green for now. he is a guy that I'll probably be trying to play in DFS if he ends up being like a contrarian guy, just because the workload is huge. And the target per route run, as I mentioned. Tyler Boyd here, and this actually is another point on Green, right? So if Green is going to get passed, it's because the team makes a decision that he is washed. Well, who are they going to put in those routes? They're not going to put in Tyler Boyd, because Tyler Boyd's not going to run his routes 15.4 yards downfield. Like, that's not his role. He's going to have the much closer to the line of scrimmage slot wide receiver role. And Boyd isn't earning targets at a high rate right now. So that is also, I think, a concern for how well he's connecting with Burrow, and hurts the case for Boyd becoming this alpha in the offense instead of Green. Boyd ran 90% of routes. He had 14% target share, 9% air yard share. So I think, to be honest, he kind of looks like a weak start overall, and not someone I'd be betting on to like pass Green as the alpha in this offense. And then no other wide receivers have above a 7% target share in this offense. You have John Ross now getting phased out for T. Higgins. Maybe in week 7, week 8 or something, T. Higgins becomes the alpha in this offense with a big breakout, over the course of the next few weeks, and sort of solidifies that role. But I don't think it's going to happen in week 3 or week 4 or week 5. So Green is someone that I feel comfortable betting on for the short term anyway. At tight end, CJ Uzoma does not look that interesting to me despite the touchdown. He saw 6 targets on 34 routes. Drew Sample was also heavily involved. He saw 8 targets on 33 routes on the season. Uzoma's targets per route run is 17% and Sample's is 22%. So I think that's something to keep in mind if Uzoma gets banged up, sort of a less dramatic version of what we had last year with Gerald Everett and Tyler Higbee, where the guy getting less involvement was actually earning targets at a higher rate. So Sample's someone to keep in mind. I think someone maybe 2 stash away if you've got the roster spot. A little tight this week with all the injuries, but someone to just have on your speed dial. In Cleveland, through 2 weeks, Nick Chubb has actually run more routes than Kareem Hunt, but Hunt has seen 5 more targets. And Chubb does have an advantage in green zone touches. He's got a 5-2 advantage in green zone rushes, but Hunt also has a target and reception inside the 10-yard line. I think going into this week, they're playing Washington at home, so you could see them leaning on Chubb again. But, you guys realize, Chubb is definitely game script dependent. And I think even in good game scripts, it looks like Hunt will be pretty involved. It's a little hard. I was talking to Mike Leone about this one, and it's just like both these games are kind of weird. So I think we should probably still admit we don't know exactly how this backfield's going to break out. But I think at a minimum, we think Chubb could really eat in positive game script, but negative game script is not going to be a place where he thrives. Odell Beckham had a pretty nice week. He actually was like the most consistent, I think, of all the big name players. He got 29% of targets both in week 1 and in week 2. His air yard share was 40% in week 1, 41% in week 2. So he's just locked into this role. He was very efficient this week with a 3.52 yards per route run. The only thing holding him back was Baker Mayfield only dropped back 24 times. So that limited the volume of the offense. I mean, if this had been expanded by a team that was passing more, he could have had a monster week. Jarvis Landry ran a route on 79% of dropbacks for the second week in a row. Through 2 weeks, he has a 16% target share, 16% air yard share. I think he's a tough start until he begins running more routes, or he can cut into this Beckham target share a little bit. I think it's possible that he does do that down the line. I mean, it just depends on, like, is he, does Beckham now healthy have this great connection with Mayfield? It's just a little bit of noise right now. Is Landry still recovering from this hip? I think that it may be that Landry's not at 100%, just given that he's not running his full slate of routes. So we'll have to see if that improves at all. Austin Hooper saw 4 targets on 19 routes, but his targets per route run through 2 weeks is still 13%. That's not good at all. Harrison Bryant continues to be involved. And, you saw with Njoku on IR last week, I was saying I think it could be better for Bryant actually than Hooper, just given that the concern with Hooper is that he doesn't earn targets very well, and he didn't do that in week 1. And I think that's maybe this opens the door for the rookie Bryant to shine a little bit, because I still don't know exactly when Njoku's coming back. He's eligible week 5. Not clear if that will be when he returns, but right now this whole tight end situation looks pretty gross. In Dallas, Zeke has a 13% target share, which is pretty nice for a running back. That's on the season. He's a true workhorse. He has no game script red flags. He leads all running backs in expected points. I mean, this guy is locked in with the injury to Saquon now, with the injury to Christian McCaffrey. This could end up being a Zeke year. Like, you just needed to have the 103, kind of like you needed to have the 102 last year to save yourself from drafting Barkley and to draft CMC. I mean, it's definitely an option or possibility that you just needed Zeke this year. Amari Cooper wasn't as dominant as week 1, but he still had a 20% target share, 33% air yard share. He's currently 8th in the NFL in Whopper, getting a huge role in this offense. Michael Gallup is going to continue frustrating us. He has this super deep ADOT. So the same sort of thing with Kirk. Through 2 weeks, Gallup has an ADOT of 17.9. In week 1, it was 17.9, and then it went up to 20.6 this past week. CD Lamb is kind of operating a little bit shallower, and as a result has been more consistent, but he doesn't actually have a much bigger role in this offense. Lamb has a whopper of 0.38. Gallup has a whopper of 0.37. They have identical shares within the offense, but Lamb has been able to capitalize on his targets so far. He has a yards per route run of 2.04, which is an elite mark for a rookie wide receiver. He looks like an awesome play in Dynasty. Definitely was way undervalued. I think just, the hype around some of these running backs really pushed down the Dynasty wide receivers this year. And Lamb looks like he could just be a star going forward. But I do think that we need to be a little bit cautious about just anointing him as the wide receiver 2 ahead of Gallup in this offense. Gallup and Lamb both have similar roles. And, as soon as next week, Gallup could have a monster week because, again, the high variance role that he's in, it only takes a few plays for him to really make his week. Tony Pollard, I should have mentioned this with Zeke, but, I mean, he ran 5 routes. Think about that game, right? They're coming back the whole game, basically. They're in negative game script. They're having to pass. They're having to play up tempo. They had to get an onside kick recovery, and Pollard runs 5 routes. Like, he's just worthless right now. He has absolutely zero standalone value, but you can't drop him. You can't drop him because of his contingent value. If Zeke were to be hurt for, 2-3 weeks, like, Pollard looks like he could have that Latavius Murray stretch where he's scoring 30 points a game. He probably wouldn't be worth more than Zeke because I think Zeke's better and he's getting all the work, but he could approximate Zeke. I think Tony Pollard is a really, really interesting running back. I think he'd be great in that role. So it's like one of those things where he's probably a roster clogger this year, but like, if he became available in FFPC, I'd want to pick him up, cheap, but I think he should be owned. It's really tough with Pollard, but I do think he should be owned. Dalton Schultz was, I was lukewarm on him last week on this show, but Sean Siegel did put in a bid for him, and we did have him as our replacement for George Kittle in that Football Guys team. So that was nice. And I jokingly called him this year's Mike Gesicki in that email thread, and I think I kind of nailed that. It wasn't quite for the reason that I was saying. I was saying this before the game was played, but they both kind of broke out in tandem. Schultz had a 22% target share, which led the team, and he was targeted on 29% of his routes, which is elite. So, he's been a blocker to this point. It's one game. We need to temper our expectations, but he definitely looks a lot more interesting than he did before week 2. And I also think a reason in the short term to temper expectations on Lamb, like, we're not going to have that crazy game script every week, obviously. So the pie is going to shrink here. And I think that a lot of mouths to feed, and Lamb is not clearly the wide receiver 2 in this offense, and now you have a tight end emerging. So I'd be a little careful with how bullish you are about Lamb in the short term. In Denver, Drew Lock now out multiple weeks with his shoulder injury. He wasn't playing well, though. Jeff Driscoll actually ranks slightly better in Ben Baldwin's Dakota rating so far. I don't talk a ton about quarterbacks and mostly just looking at this for how it's going to affect the offense. I don't know. Maybe it won't affect the offense that much, but I do think it removes some of the ceiling. Like, we're not going to see this offense take off with Jeff Driscoll. And there was at least, some outcomes, I think, where this offense clicked finally with Locke. Melvin Gordon did dominate work with Phillip Lindsay out. This next week looks pretty tough. They're going to have a backup quarterback against Tampa Bay, but Gordon does get the Jets in week 4. I think, maybe he'll be the super chalk play. I don't know, but just something to keep in mind. If we should keep our eye on how big this workload is this week, and the play is probably week 4. Cortland Sutton, God, that one really hurt, man. I didn't even realize it was on the table that he had an ACL tear, because I thought he just left the game with cramps. So today kind of got that one out of nowhere. And Sutton looked like, he only ran 20 routes, but he was getting targeted on an extremely high rate when on the field. Just a huge bummer. Just a huge bummer to lose him. Jerry Jeudy looks like he's probably going to be the guy here now. Through 2 weeks, he's only run a route on 65% of dropbacks. So when you look at that, and then the fact that he has this 0.5 Whopper, Whoppers, when you're on the field, you only have a chance to earn those air yards and those targets when you're actually running routes. But Jeudy now will run more routes. Like, he's not going to run a route on 65% of dropbacks now with Sutton out of the lineup. Like, he almost has to become a full-time player. And so I do think he has like alpha wide receiver target share, air yard share, like it's a decently likely outcome going forward. I think he's probably the most likely guy to step up. Fant would be the other guy, but Fant has had some trouble earning targets thus far. That was actually a concern entering the season. He wasn't targeted at a high rate last year. He was super efficient last year. So, you're hoping that the offense will make it more of, scheme ways to get him the ball, or have him be the first read on more plays or whatever, and just hopefully develop a better chemistry with his quarterback. But he hasn't earned targets at a very high rate, just 17.5% through 2 weeks. I do think he probably looks to benefit some, but I would say Judy's probably more likely to ultimately emerge as the go-to guy in the offense with Sutton out. Fant has continued to be very efficient, though, with a 2.19 yards per route run. So in Dynasty, I think he looks like potentially, eventually, he's going to emerge as this elite tight end. KJ Hamler is a guy that now becomes interesting, because he is the deep threat in this offense now, and that is a role that Sutton really filled well. He was kind of that alpha who could also burn you deep. Hamler has an 8 out of 16.6, 23% of air yards, and he is getting that air yard share again, like Jeudy, without running all the routes. He only ran routes on 40% of dropbacks so far. So he could see his role really spike. And if he's getting 23% of air yards on just a 40% slate of routes, then, man, if he gets 80, 90, he's running routes on 80, 90% of dropbacks, which I think is reasonable now, he could be pretty involved. And definitely someone, like, if his owner is holding on a little loosely in Dynasty, I would definitely be making offers for him this week, and I pretty much own him everywhere. But I would be making offers, and I think someone to pick up very cheaply in high stakes. In Detroit, Carrion Johnson kind of comes back from the dead. This backfield is basically just a mess on the ground, but Deandre Swift, he's earning a major role as a receiver. He has a 14% target share. Like, remember, Ezekiel Elliott has a 13% target share. The 14% target share is really nice for a running back. So if Swift can consolidate a little bit more of this rushing work, he could be emerging as like a major force on the as a running back. I mean, he's looking like, both a real nice dynasty payoff and a guy who can emerge from that 5th, 6th round in redraft leagues. Quintus Cyphus, his targets fell way off. He had a pretty bad week 1, ton of volume, but no efficiency. He was actually pretty efficient this week. I do think that he does have a role when Kenny Golladay returns. I'm not sure how big the role is going to be. And I also think we have to take him a little bit seriously in Dynasty. I mean, he earned a role right away. He's now shown, some ability to play at least decently efficiently at the NFL level. And I think long-term he profiles as potentially their slot receiver. And, if Amendola and Marvin Jones were to leave and he's kind of the number 2 wide receiver in a shorter, in a more shallow A-dot type of role, that could be pretty interesting long-term. And I imagine he'll be pretty cheap in a couple weeks here once Golladay gets back. Danny Amendola has a whopper of 0.6 through 2 weeks. He's like clearly the lead wide receiver at the moment, which I think can help explain why Matthew Stafford is not playing that well. He doesn't have really high quality targets. Like I said, I mean, Cyphus can be something maybe, but it's probably going to be, you're going to have him like a year or 2 from now. Amendola is your wide receiver 1 is just not really going to cut it. TJ Hawkinson's target per route run, it dropped last week from 18%, which was already mediocre, down to 16%, which is pretty poor. And Galladay's out. So I'm getting a little bit concerned about Hawkinson just not getting these targets. He got targeted at a decent rate last year, 18.5%. But, that's good for a rookie. We want him to then take that role. It's the rookies who've been targeted around that 18+%, and they were efficient. Then they can take the leap to where they're up above 20%. They're really a big part of the offense. We're not seeing that yet from Hawkinson. Doesn't mean that it can't happen. I'm not panicking, but he's yet to really flash signs this year of a big breakout. Hopefully that'll change soon. In Green Bay, man, Aaron Jones, I already mentioned it before, but expected points, I really think expected points helps sort out like those split backfields and helps identify some of the guys that they're not getting every touch, not getting every snap, but they're getting what matters. They're getting, it's kind of the opposite of Ben Gresh's trap stat where, you're looking at the high value touches in comparison to their total workload. And Jones is like a super low trap guy, right? He gets all the high value stuff without any of those empty calories. Marquez Valdes-Scantling at wide receiver, he led all Green Bay wide receivers and tight ends in target share and air yard share. Definitely looks like the wide receiver 2 in this offense. I think he has put some distance between himself and Lazard. Devontae Adams had a pretty disappointing week, but still has a whopper of 0.62 on the season, and I think looks like a stud going forward. And part of the reason is that even if Valdes-Scantling continues to have a decent role, there's just no one at tight end here. Robert Tonyan was the clear tight end 1 this week, but targeted on just 13% of his routes. And I think we can pretty much just ignore all of these tight ends for now. It comes down to MVS, Aaron Jones, Devontae Adams, and like maybe a little Lazard here. In Houston, David Johnson has 48 yards on 67 routes. He has yet to get a carry inside the 10-yard line. He is getting all the running back work here, but the running back work here has not been valuable. And also, he might not always get all the running back work here if Duke Johnson can get back healthy. So it's sort of like a fragile hold on a shitty roll. It's not great for David Johnson. Will Fuller, his usage last week was absurd. And then this week, absurd for the wrong reason. Not targeted. He ran around on 67% of dropbacks. He was struggling with some sort of injury, but I'm not sure to the extent that we can blame that. I mean, obviously it played some role, but he did run a route on 2/3 of dropbacks and, not targeted. So it's frustrating. It's definitely frustrating, especially after how awesome that week 1 was. And then you have Brandon Cooks. He was good. He had a whopper of 0.66. That's pretty nice. He had a yards per route run of 2.32. That's good. So Brandon Cook's filling in pretty nicely here with the opportunity. Making a case for himself to stay pretty involved going forward. The nice thing, I guess, if you're on Cooks or Fuller, is that these tight ends aren't super involved. But Jordan Akins, he got 7 targets. Fells got the touchdown. I think that the problem with these guys is that they're going to sort of cannibalize each other's production. But yeah, they're not a gigantic part of the offense, although Akins had a little bit more involvement than he typically does. In Indianapolis, Jonathan Taylor ran 17 routes to Nyheim Hines' six routes. Although Taylor saw only 2 targets. So would like to see him a little bit more involved with all those routes. The good news is that he got both green zone carries this week after Hines got 2 last week and Taylor only got 1, which makes sense. I mean, we would expect the massive Taylor to be the guy who they use in that role, but it was nice to see. Paris Campbell, another really awful injury. He looked like he was emerging as a co-wide receiver one in this offense. And, sidelined indefinitely with a PCL injury. So another rough one here. T.Y. Hilton, he's got an ADOT of 17.4. He had that this past week, and he was at 13.7 last week. I'm wondering if maybe Hilton, he'll soak up some of the volume, but he feels like he's kind of in that old Mike Williams role, and Campbell looked like maybe he was going to be that Keenan Allen role. I don't know. I mean, maybe Pittman becomes kind of the new underneath guy. He only has an ADOT of 7.7, so he sort of fits that more shallow target look. And he had a whopper of 0.51 this week, so he was already pretty heavily involved. It was pretty clear that Campbell was ahead of him. I think that probably would have stayed the case, but now Pittman has an opportunity to get a lot more routes in, and he could end up operating underneath, which is a good place to be when Phillip Rivers is your quarterback. Alternatively, though, Mo Alley-Cox, he could be a big winner here if Jack Doyle continues to miss time. Mo Alley-Cox had a whopper of 0.61 this week. He was targeted on 37.5% of his routes. If he gets the ability to run some more routes here, if they're, after a very strong showing, if he is a bigger part of the offensive game plan moving forward now that Campbell is out, he could be pretty interesting. So someone I would definitely consider, buying the buzz on a little bit, seeing if he's still available in any of your leagues. Not a guy I'm like crazy psyched about, because Jack Doyle I think will be back pretty soon, but very nice week as a starter. And Jacksonville, James Robinson, he's taken over this backfield, but averaging just 11.6 PPR expected points per game. It's not terrible, but it's not likely to be a hugely valuable role here. The wide receiver situation also looking messy. Through 2 weeks, Keelan Cole leads the team in target share, but has just a 19% target share. DJ Chark leads the team with just 18% of air yards. So both pies are getting super split up. You're not even seeing like Chark. It would be nice if he had like a 26% share of air yards and just hadn't connected, right? That's not the case. He is leading the team, but 18% is not a big share of air yards. So kind of frustrating, kind of disappointing that you're seeing these wide receivers just so split. That could change. Our priors would be that Chark eventually does prove that he's the number one target in this offense. I think that probably will happen, but it's tough to see a path to him really becoming like a dominant alpha, which was certainly something we were hoping for and thinking was quite possible before the season. Shenault had 5 carries in this game. He only had 4 targets. We were excited for him to get worked in as a rusher, but we didn't expect him to be getting more carries than targets. I would like to see him getting a little bit more run as a wide receiver. He only ran a route on 58% of dropbacks. But, that mixed usage is nice. I think he is already kind of a spot starter with all the injuries that we saw. We'll probably end up starting him in some of our leagues, just given the Sutton loss. We had a ton of Sutton. So he's already in the mix there. And, all he needs is some of those some of those carries, to come near the goal line, right? He's getting those 5 carries. If the team can just run a little bit better and get a more valuable workload to its rushers, then maybe he can steal a goal line carry or two, and that's all you really need in that kind of that flex position that you'll have him in. If you're like us and you've got some injuries to fill this week. Tyler Eifert emerged in week 2. I feel like he's just another mouth to feed. This is, again, kind of frustrating because of the wide receiver situation. He was targeted on only 17% of his routes this past week. He's at 14% for the season. So just feels more like a thorn in the side of the wide receivers than like really a strong play on his own. But, did have a better week 2 than week 1. In Kansas City, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, he's the running back 3 in expected points. He's got a tough matchup this week at Baltimore, but I think he's going to have some monster games this year. He saw 7 targets in this game. There should be no concerns about his role as a 3-down back. He got all of that goal line work, which was just huge for his potential value. In the right setup, he could have just one of those huge, like Aaron Jones week 2 type of games where you just need to have him. I think, obviously in order to do that, he's going to run super hot on efficiency, but that's kind of the formula, right? You get the guys that have the big workload to start, and then you just happen to have them in that right week where the efficiency hits too. I do think he's got that formula and should deliver some of those big weeks this year. This was a Travis Kelce game in the passing game. He had 36% of the targets, 44% of the air yards. Tyreek Hill, though, he's still pretty involved. He got the 0.5 Whopper, and he'll have some big days. It's just a matter of this offense clicking a little bit better. I mean, they haven't been bad to the Chiefs, but I do think that we'll see he'll have his days. Miko Hardman was involved in this one. Still just like a role player with a role that you can't rely on, but at least he had some targets. He had a Whopper of 0.19 in this. So it was nice to see him. He's got a while to go until, he can really be startable. But I've got some dynasty shares. I feel better about those. The Raiders have played. I think we're going to be, talking about Rashard coming back from the dead. They're going to be talking about Waller. He looks like a smash, but I don't have the stats, so we'll skip them for now. The Chargers, Justin Herbert at quarterback. I think this is really nice for Austin Eckler. He saw 4 targets on 19 routes in week 2 compared to 1 target on 22 routes in week 1. You also have Joshua Kelly getting targeted twice on 11 routes in week 2. And so I think Herbert can bring back some of that value in running back targets that we were worried might be gone with Tyrod Taylor. I think Herbert looks better for pretty much this entire offense. Like Keenan Allen saw his usage spike. His target share increased from 26% to 32%. His air yard share increased from 28% to 37%. It's probably bad for Mike Williams, or could be bad for Mike Williams. He saw a lot less work than he did in week 1, but he also had an inefficient week 1, and it's also just 1 week with a new quarterback. So maybe Williams ends up being just fine with Herbert. It looks like Herbert's a better quarterback. I mean, just week 1, but it looked pretty good. So I'm hoping that Herbert stays under center. And I definitely think, we'll see how it ends up shaking out with Allen, with Williams, but I think it's definitely good for the running backs. The other thing with the running backs is that Kelly had 3 green zone rushes this week. He now has 6 on the season. He looks like just a total smash, especially with those 2 targets. I think especially if Herbert stays in place and then you're getting the 3 green zone rushes. You won't get 3 every week, but it's pretty nice. It's pretty nice with Kelly. I mean, you could be looking at a bunch of touchdowns with Kelly and still enough volume as a receiver. Either way, he's looking like a really nice value pick. Hunter Henry, maybe the one guy it doesn't matter for if he has either Taylor or Herbert. He's had a 27% targets per route run through 2 weeks. I think he looks like a potentially elite tight end this year, like regardless of who the quarterback ends up being. He had a really strong connection with Taylor. That was the report in camp as well, not just off the 1 week, but in camp, all the beats were saying that Henry was really the go-to guy for Taylor. So it's nice to see that Herbert comes in and is looking for him as well. Moving to the Rams, Darrell Henderson had a great game. He only ran 9 routes, though. He did split green zone work evenly with Malcolm Brown. But, this is a guy that the team should be excited about seeing more of. Drafted in the 3rd round, they have to think that they kind of know what they have in Malcolm Brown. So seeing him play so well, I think, is a really good sign here, giving them an excuse to, see what else they can get out of him, maybe see his role expand next week. Malcolm Brown, I do think will stick around to some degree. He had 2 carries inside the 10, so that is especially he's going to be kind of a pain in the ass because he'll probably still get mixed in at the goal line, which really matters, and he can catch the ball a little bit as well. The nice thing for Henderson and Brown owners, it looks like Akers might miss a little bit of time here, so you get a chance to see how they want to deploy these 2 guys before Akers comes in and makes, the samples kind of split 3 ways. Maybe Henderson gets a chance to pull ahead of Brown before Akers gets back, which would then at least you'd have Henderson and Akers being startable, probably. Van Jefferson, not a guy I was on. A guy I'm having trouble getting on still, but look, he's the deep threat in the offense. He's got a 28% air yard share, and this is something we heard was going to be the case entering the season, that he had basically beaten out Josh Reynolds in camp for the deep threat role that was reported late in camp, and Jefferson has an ADOT of 12.8, like I said, 28% of the air yards, and he is the only Rams pass catcher with an ADOT above 10. So a very clear-cut role, and a role that no one else on the team seems to have, which I think is helpful for him maintaining that role. Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp had pretty similar receiving lines, but Woods is seeing a much bigger share of the offense, and I do think he's the better bet going forward, and that is even before we factor in the fact, he can rush the ball, as we saw this week with a touchdown. Just as a pure receiver, I think Woods looks like the better bet over Kupp right now. Tyler Higbee saw a target on 33% of his routes after just 18% last week. This was the reason that I was on Higbee, is that he was earning targets at a really high rate last year. I have a bunch of him in best ball just because I was really excited about the possibility. A lot of the research that I was doing, it was pointing me this idea of, hey, the way he's running, yes, he's not going to be able to maintain like that 30+% targets per route run, but that is the part that we do want to care a lot about. And so I ended up being on Higbee, but the funny thing is, I actually think this week is just kind of a fluke. So it's sort of like I think this week I was like right for the wrong reasons, because he only ran a route on 50% of dropbacks. So this monster 3 touchdown day does feel pretty fluky to me. Again, the targets per route run is nice, but they have him kind of scaled back in the offense a bit. So we'll have to see. I'm actually not entirely sure why that is, because Gerald Everett only ran 7 routes. So, Higbee has been targeted on 24% of his routes this year, which that is really nice. But I'm wondering if maybe Van Jefferson's involvement, or I'm not really even sure why, but he's not running as many routes as last year. So that's not ideal. Miami Dolphins, Myles Gaskin has that elite target share of 14%. He is running back 20 in expected points right now. He looks like a clear-cut starter for me on multiple teams going forward, including a dynasty team where I felt like I was the clear-cut favorite. But having lost Christian McCaffrey there, and you can probably guess who my other starter is in that league, who may have just lost his starting job. I'm probably starting Myles Gaskin. So, I kind of feel okay about it, given the size of the workload and the fact that the workload is coming in the passing game. He's not going to get a ton. Gaskin is not going to get a ton of carries inside the 10, because Jordan Howard definitely has a clear lead there. But Gaskin did see an attempt there this past week. Just nice that he's getting mixed in at all. He's not just purely that receiving back only. So that's kind of cool. Matt Breida looks like dust. I don't think he's just not getting anything valuable. just kind of a pure trap back. And I think he's probably droppable if you need a roster spot. Patrick Laird, I don't believe was targeted in this one. I still have the note from last week where he's targeted on 100% of his routes. I believe that that party has ended for the time being. Although I'm sure he'll come back. He'll rebound nicely in week 3. Devante Parker, he led the team in routes, but had just a 1.13 yards per route run. And let's see, Isaiah Ford was heavily involved this week with a 20% target share and 21% air yard share. He ran 73% of routes. Mike Gesicki had a really nice week. Made me look silly because I've been fading Gesicki. He was targeted on 31% of routes, which is actually the reason I was fading Gesicki, that he had been targeted down in that 15-16% of his routes last year. He was targeted on 18.5% last week, which is better than 2019, but still not great. And this week was what we were looking for. So really nice from Gesicki. On the season, he's now at 25.4%, which is excellent. He also is showing yards per target efficiency that's nice at 10.6, which is kind of making the case for himself with a team that, hey, I'm actually good in this role. Keep using me here. So if you're on Gesicki, I think you're feeling really good right now. If you're not on Gesicki like me, you're thinking, this guy didn't have the ability to earn targets at a high rate for 2 years. He didn't really do that in week 1. This is one game. Let's see it one more time before we get that excited about it. But this is a really nice game, and I don't want to discount that. So, in fact, I will say as well, especially for DFS and stuff, his ADOT is 11 right now. So if he is what he showed this week, he does have some pretty nice upside. He's not one of these tight ends who gets targeted like 6 yards downfield. He gets targeted a little bit deeper downfield. And this is one of the first times he's shown super strong efficiency and, or even just strong efficiency. And yeah, if he's getting targeted at a really nice rate, running a lot of routes, and we knew even the faders like me recognized that he was going to run a lot of routes. It just was how many targets can he earn? So I think a decent ceiling on Gesicki. At least we'll have to see how he does. But yeah, we got to update that prior. His ceiling's a bit higher than it looked like to me before the season. In Minnesota, Alexander Mattison was again involved as a receiver. He only ran a few routes. He has 6 targets on 15 routes on the season. Cook has 4 targets on 36 routes. Would like to see Cook more involved here as a receiver. I don't think Mattison is like a huge problem for Cook, but definitely a little bit of a thorn in his side. But I think the main reason to talk about this is that if Cook were to go down, Mattison could be really, really nice. And it's kind of surprising to me just how involved he is and, the profile that he now seems to have of being like a true 3-down workhorse if Cook were to go down. A little bit surprising given what he did last year, but hey, we need to be aware of the fact that Mattison does look like he has elite contingent value. Cook is running back 8 in expected points, but like I said, not getting workhorse treatment, not getting like true workhorse treatment so far. There's a little bit of drop off in expected points once you get down to Cook, not in that range of the guys who are getting like 20 expected points per game, like some of the other guys, like the top guys. Adam Thielen had a whopper of 0.84 this week, but he converted 146 air yards into just 31 yards. So just a really inefficient performance. Keep riding Adam Thielen. He's got a huge role. He's going to have big days like he had in week 1 going forward. He is the guy in this offense right now, this passing offense. Justin Jefferson, pretty good week 2. He had a 2.32 yards per out run. That's good. 19 routes, small sample, but much stronger week 2 than week 1. BC Johnson ran 23 routes, but just delivered 1 reception for 24 yards. Kind of a reverse situation where last week BC Johnson was really efficient but ran less routes. This week he ran more routes, but Justin Jefferson was more efficient. I think this is going to keep happening, kind of battling it out for this spot. If probably Jefferson, because I think BC, we know he is. He's not gonna blow the doors off. If Jefferson can consolidate this role, and flashed some ability this week, then maybe he can actually become pretty interesting. Irv Smith and Kyle Rudolph again split work. Smith ran 17 routes. Rudolph ran 19. Smith got 4 targets, which is not bad, but converted into just 3 yards. So Smith is another fade of mine and one that I think down the line he could be interesting, but I don't think it's going to happen this year. That's been my position, and it's still my position. In New England, Cam Newton, he's soaking up all the rushing value, man. Like, I guess I could see James White being spot startable once he returns, but there's just not a lot of value in this backfield. When, you've got your quarterback, he's the goal line back, so that limits everything but the passing work. Damiere Byrd, he led the team in routes in week 2 with 45. N'Keal Harry had 44, and Julian Edelman had 39. Edelman had a 4.59 yards per route run, ran extremely hot. He had 49% of the air yards here, which, okay, the 4.59 yards per route run, obviously it's like 34-year-old Julian Edelman. He's not going to always be that efficient. No one's always going to be that efficient, yada, yada. But the 49% of the air yards, it's like he's being used in this offense in a very non-Edelman way. I think we need to maybe think a little bit differently about Julian Edelman now that he's with Cam Newton in this particular offense. He has an 8 out of 12.9 through 2 weeks. He's not just an underneath only guy. And I think that does make him a little bit more interesting. So, maybe we don't fully know what Julian Edelman is because the quarterback has changed and the role does seem to have changed slightly to be a little bit more of a high upside role. N'Keal Harry wasn't efficient on a per target basis, but he is earning targets efficiently. 27% targets per route run in week 2 and for the season. His Whopper of 0.59 on the season is pretty good. He looks like a startable flex going forward. We do need to see some improvement in his yards per target. That's more of my concern with Harry is just him being benched because, that fumble week 1 kind of inconsistent in terms of what he's actually delivering when targeted. But Cam is looking for him. He's targeting him at a very high rate. There's not a lot of other guys in this offense. Damiere Byrd got a decent amount of targets in this one, but I'm not that concerned about Byrd. So I think Harry's probably he's insulated by the lack of other options right now. So I think he's someone, even like ahead of a Chenault or whatever in those flex fill-in type of plays. I like Harry. And especially in scripts where the Patriots need to throw more because it's been just kind of a little bit of a low volume passing attack. But Harry looking like he could have a little bit of a second-year breakout. Izzo has run a route on 81% of dropbacks. That's the tight end. Ryan Izzo has just 3 targets on a fair amount of routes. So, I think that's another thing helping these wide receivers here. That's why you're seeing such massive volume for Julian Edelman is that there's no tight end really. There's not really much wide receiver competition. New Orleans, we will be talking about Kamara. We will be talking about some of the ancillary pieces here, but Kamara actually helped us win in our main event league. We pulled out an unlikely win to get to 1-1 there. We'll cover that on Wednesday. And New York with the Giants. With Saquon out, God, another huge bummer. I think I like Gallman more than Dion Lewis. He looks like more like the direct backup. Very open to kind of changing my mind on this as the week progresses, but I don't think I want to blow a huge percentage of fab on these guys. And that sounds like maybe Devonta Freeman, by the time you've heard this, maybe he will have signed in New York. I don't know, but it's just not a situation where I want to spend a lot of fab on either guy. I think I said this earlier, Gallman, maybe kind of a worse James Robinson or something like that. So could be a way to quickly waste a bunch of your fab percentage. But obviously you gotta put in a bid for these guys at some price. Darius Slayton, I think, could end up benefiting if Sterling Shepard misses a few weeks with his injury. Slayton does appear to be emerging as the top option in this offense. He has an 8 out of 11.5, which I really like, because like with Slayton, we talk about these guys, right? Like Julio, like Kirk, like Gallup. They have these super deep ADOTs, and it's creating variance. And it's also not what you tend to see from like the true number one fantasy wide receivers. They tend to have the ADOTs that they're not super, super shallow, but they're not super, super deep because they're getting a mix of some deep targets and they're getting a mix of some underneath stuff. Kind of helps keep that reliability up, but they also have the upside of some of those deep targets. And Slayton with this 11.5 ADOT, when, last year he was more of kind of a deep threat guy. It's nice to see. It's only through 2 weeks, but, as he's sort of emerging as the number one guy, that's something I have my eye on because kind of shows that maybe he's not just running hot, but that he is in fact starting to emerge as like a wide receiver one, an NFL wide receiver one. Golden Tate had a 14% target share in week 2. Doesn't look all that interesting to me, even without Shepard. I think Evan Ingram does look a bit more interesting without Shepard. He's had a little bit of trouble carving out targets, getting targeted on 18% of his routes, but that's not terrible. And I think now without Shepard to deal with, he could see a jump up in targets. So I'd be betting on Slayton. I'd be betting on Ingram in Shepard's absence. And, who knows, maybe even with Barkley out, it could end up helping some of the shallower targets to Ingram and maybe even to Tate. In the New York Jets, Frank Gore had 12.8 expected points. I think he is a guy that could see, the starting lineup. I actually already joked tonight with Pete about putting him in one of our lineups. I don't know if that'll fly, but hey, 12.8 expected points, that's not that bad. Obviously, it's Frank Gore, so he ran way under that in terms of what he actually delivered, but I don't know. Hopefully don't put him in the lineup, but he is getting a role here. This offense just sucks, which is why we probably ultimately end up dropping Gore rather than starting him. And it's like, it sucks partly because they lost Jameson Crowder. Like, he seemed to be the engine of their offense, which is, kind of embarrassing for this team. But you see Chris Hogan now, he's run a route on over 90% of dropbacks. Chris Hogan has run a route on over 90% of dropbacks for this team in 2020. Okay, he's earned 12 targets, which is a lot more actually than I thought he would have. But, he's not doing a ton of great stuff for this offense, and he's out there pretty much every play. Chris Herndon, huge disappointment this week, had just 1 reception for 5 yards. He did have a target on 90% of his routes. It's not, it's not great. It's not terrible. He's got a target per route run of 25.5% on the season. I wouldn't write him off. Tight end's a variant position. The offense as a whole is really struggling. I think he could end up having some strong weeks. It's the Jets. I don't want to, chase a guy on the Jets, but I guess it's just like, eventually who else are they going to throw to? Because right now they're throwing to Chris Hogan. So moving to Philadelphia, we've got Miles Sanders, workhorse in his return. He had 24.2 expected points. Boston Scott had 7.4 in relief. Sanders looks like a very strong play next week. They get the Bengals. This could be kind of a bounce back week for the entire offense. Carson Wentz has really struggled so far. Would really like to see him have a strong game against the Bengals, which should be doable. But maybe instead they just run it down their throats like Cleveland did, in which case Sanders could absolutely smash. In not great script, the Rams, in that loss to the Rams, had that really nice expected point workload. Jalen Rhaegar ran a route on 84% of dropbacks. That led all wide receivers on the Eagles, was slightly behind Zach Ertz for the team lead. Rhaegar has a little bit of room to grow in terms of the percentage of dropbacks that he's running a route on, but he's growing into a full-time player here, which is nice to see. Desean Jackson's whopper of 0.54 on the season is pretty solid. He has some spike week potential. I think he has some spike week potential this week, actually. Zach Ertz, he led the team in routes run with 36. He saw 7 targets, but he converted for just 18 yards. And I think he's in the process of getting passed by Dallas Goedert, who's not only the tight end 1 probably on this team, or at least arguably, but he is the top targeted player in this offense. He literally leads them in targets. And what's interesting is he's done that while running 9 less routes than Ertz. So, he's out there less and he's getting targeted more. He's been more efficient when targeted. His yards per target is 8.2 versus Ertz's, which is 4.3. So there's a decision the coaches can make, right? It's like, who are we going to have out there running more routes? Right now they're picking Ertz. That could change. They could end up picking Goddard. He's already earning targets when he's running routes at a higher rate. Ertz's your per target efficiency has never been very good, at least not for the last few years. So that's the thing we want to pay attention to the least, but it's all kind of pointing in Goddard's favor right now. JJ Ortega Whiteside has 2 targets on 26 routes this season. I think he's in the process of becoming a pretty big bust. The Steelers, James Conner was back to being a workhorse in week 2. I think you can start him with confidence for the time being. Snell should still be owned everywhere. He has huge contingent value. This is a reminder that Conner is a free agent after the season. Snell should be owned on all of your dynasty rosters. I'm guessing you might be able to get him pretty cheap in the next 2 to 3 weeks, maybe even this week with the week that Conner had. Someone could just be kind of disappointed in what they paid to get Snell or what they thought they had in Snell, and you can get him cheaply before they realize that, Conner, I would say less likely than not to, more likely than not to be elsewhere next year. So Snell, I think, at least a 50-50 shot to be the starter there. They got to always draft someone. Maybe it's probably less than that, but you get it. He's a value right now in Dynasty. Deonte Johnson looking like the clear-cut top option in the offense after 2 weeks. He has a target share of 32%, an air yard share of 32%. Juju Smith-Schuster has a target share of 19%, 13% air yard share. Juju's running more routes, which is, on the one hand, I guess, good, but it also, I think, makes me more willing to buy into the idea that Deonte Johnson really is the alpha in this offense, because this isn't happening. We're looking at what these guys are doing in terms of earning targets. Well, Juju's out there. He's not banged up. He's not, sitting on the bench with some ailment like we're worried about with Will Fuller or whatever. He is out there running the routes, and they're going to Deonte Johnson. So I'm actually a little bit more concerned, or a little bit more willing to buy into this emergence from Deonte Johnson, given that Juju's actually running slightly more routes than Johnson. Chase Claypool, another guy that I'm starting to really buy into. He ran 7 routes in week 1. He ran 13 routes last week. His yards per route run was 5.57 in week 1 and then 6.67 in week 2. This guy is just crushing right now. He looks like an amazing value in Dynasty. You could get him in the late second, the early third at times. I mean, he was just super underpriced and just looks like a smash. Look, I mean, his efficiency is going to go way down, but I think he's just going to keep earning a bigger and bigger role. And he's earning targets at a pretty high rate when he's out there. So it's kind of fun to see how quickly he's making an impact. Eric Ebron, I think he has some, TD spike week potential, but seeing targets on just 13% of his routes, and now with Claypool, this big body guy emerging, I think it's hard to see how Ebron really returns value, even as kind of that late round dart throw. In San Francisco, Tevin Coleman saw 9.9 expected points to Jerick McKinnon's 3.3, but it looks like maybe now Mostert and Coleman are going to be out. And so if McKinnon has this whole backfield to himself, he looks like he could be a really nice play. Kind of an auto start, obviously, if you have McKinnon and those two are out. Jordan Reed was targeted on 42% of his routes. Ran a route on only 63% of dropbacks. So obviously, Jordan Reed's not going to get targeted on 42% of his routes, but he actually has a lot of room to grow here. It is Jordan Reed. We know the struggles with Jordan Reed staying healthy. We know that the team is probably, with the amount of injuries they have, the lack of playmakers, they're going to be a little bit cautious with putting him out a ton, you would think. But, if they need to score, I think Jordan Reed is going to be out on the field. And, that he looked really good, and that ability to earn targets definitely looks like it's there. Obviously, we've got some concern here with the quarterback play. So another reason not to get too crazy about Jordan Reed. Brandon Ayuk, he made his debut, but totaled -6 air yards. So hopefully he can get some targets a little bit deeper down the field in week 3. And again, we're kind of just waiting and seeing how this passing offense looks without Jimmy G. Obviously, you've got someone you can start over Ayuk until at least he gets into the positive on air yards. In Seattle, Chris Carson continues to lose work to Carlos Hyde and Travis Homer. But man, he's getting a lot of receiving work and kind of looking like a weird Aaron Jones type of situation. I know that's like kind of a name I shouldn't toss out lightly after week 2, but like an Alvin Kamara type of situation, although he just blew up tonight too. But like, I think Chris Carson, it's not the profile that we expect from Chris Carson, but he seems like he's getting still mixed in at the goal line, and he's getting a lot of receiving work. And this offense is all of a sudden passing way more than we're used to, and really should have always been kind of this explosive up-tempo passing offense that can support a really strong receiving running back. And so I don't know. I think Chris Carson maybe is kind of turned into that overnight, and I'm kind of excited about it. I don't really have much Chris Carson, but I can always get some in DFS, and that's kind of where I'm leaning right now. DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett each ran 34 routes after Metcalf ran one more route in week 1. Metcalf, again, though, dominated the air yards. He now has 44% to Lockett's 31%. My take last week is, Metcalf will be more boom or bust than Lockett, and looks like the higher upside way to play the offense overall. But I think there's paths to where he's just kind of the alpha over the course of the season. Probably more likely, that he's kind of that boom bust guy and is just running a little hot right now, but a nice start to the season for DK Metcalf. Greg Olsen just running a bunch of empty routes. Good for the wide receivers that he's out there for sure. He's got 5 targets on 47 routes. Really not an option, just kind of those empty calorie routes out there. The tight end role could be valuable if he sees that work to someone else. But for now, he's just kind of helping out Lockett and Metcalf and keeping the offense consolidated to those guys. In Tampa Bay, oh boy, what a disaster this was, right? So Ronald Jones scores the touchdown. I'm jumping. I'm having a great time. The day is going great. I'm literally he's 2-3 carries away from locking this up for me, from solidifying his role. And then from that point, everything goes wrong. First of all, I will say Leonard Fournette got the next series after the touchdown, and that had me concerned. Okay. Because you're Fournette already getting mixed in after the Rojo touchdown, not a great sign. And then Jones has the miscommunication with Brady. The stat crew gave that fumble to Brady. I don't think Brady gave that fumble to Brady because Jones did not play a lot of snaps after that. Fournette in this game had 15.2 expected points. I do think that Fournette is gonna, sure, he'll lead them in snaps. He'll be the lead back at least for the time being. Even I could see that pretty clearly. But he's gonna lose snaps to Jones. He's not gonna be some dominant back. I think that's just you kind of got your head in the sand in the opposite way that you would accuse me of having if you think that's going to be the case. And in particular, I think Lashawn McCoy is going to be a thorn in his side as well, because McCoy, in a way that I did not think was all that likely, because I thought McCoy was dust, but McCoy has a 12% target share this year. He's getting pretty heavily used. He's got a 3.5 yards per target. He should not be used. But yeah, they keep putting him in. He let up a sack last week. He didn't do that this week, but he did drop a touchdown. So, I think the best case scenario for this offense would be if Fournette is able to dislodge McCoy a bit. They do seem to like him as a receiver, and then Jones and Fournette end up splitting a lot of the rushing work, and McCoy just gets phased out of the offense, because I think McCoy is just sucking value out of this offense right now. Tom Brady, Dialed in on Mike Evans in week 2. Dialed in on him. 33% of Evans's routes he got a target. And Evans accounted for 35% of Tampa Bay's air yards. Scotty Miller also dropped a touchdown in this game. I think, he goes back to just being kind of a dynasty stash now that Godwin's returning. Could be like deep, high stakes bench depth at wide receiver, but definitely kind of a missed opportunity for Scotty Miller. Continues the theme here. Rob Gronkowski, he looks done. But the problem is he's sucking up too many routes for O.J. Howard to really be playable. Gronk has earned a target on just 10% of his routes. Howard has earned a target on 28% of his, which is great, but not getting enough routes. And we know that there's a guy ahead of him that they continue to play. So we need to keep an eye on this role, make sure that Howard is actually starting to trend up in a significant way, eat into that Gronkowski role before I think he's really all that interesting. In Tennessee, Derrick Henry, this spot, it could have been huge in week 2. He was really highly projected over at ETR. He was a guy that I had a lot of in DFS. I was, going to play the big dog, gonna get my big dog GPP winnings. But we actually have him on one of the high stakes teams because we drafted with Crack Rock. But he just whiffed, man. He had 7.5 points below the value of his workload. But look, 4 healthy running backs have 40 plus expected points this season. He's one of them. So I think he's someone to go back to. The value of these workloads, these elite workloads, you can't really replicate them. They change over the course of the season. They're very fragile, but we can predict them week to week, and he's one of the few guys that really has that monster workload. Adam Humphries, somewhat surprisingly, more involved than Corey Davis. I guess not shockingly, it is Corey Davis, but definitely wouldn't have predicted it. And Humphries was more involved. Davis has a decent whopper though through 2 weeks, 0.51. That's solid. He does ultimately look like the wide receiver play here while Brown is out over Humphries, but it's just kind of a somewhat disappointing week given what could have been for Davis. Jonnu Smith did not have a disappointing week. He got a target on 31% of his routes. He had 2 touchdowns, counted for 21% of targets, despite only running around on 59% of dropbacks. Definitely would like to see him running more routes going forward because that targets per out run of 31%, that's going to regress, but this is the kind of situation you want. You want to see a guy earning a bunch of targets and then having the opportunity to run a bunch more routes because he's really doing stuff with the offense, getting those touchdowns. It seems like he should be more involved going forward. It would just sort of make logical sense. Hopefully we do see those routes tick up next week. And then finally, looking at the Washington football team, we got Antonio Gibson. He rebounded nicely in week 2 with 12 expected points, but he did only see 2 targets, and actually J.D. McKissic got the only carry inside the 10-yard line, which was a bit of a surprise. Gibson looks more like kind of a decent flex option this week. He looks a little fragile to me, and I don't feel great about putting him in my lineup, but the nice thing about this week is it makes me feel better about him long term. I think, he should end up by the time we get into the fantasy playoffs, as long as he can stay healthy. He could have a really nice role. And maybe Haskins has taken a little bit of a step forward, and this offense as a whole picks up. Terry McLaurin had a really nice game in this one, outproduced his volume with a 3.47 yards per route run. So, ran a little hot, but his whopper of 0.64 is pretty good. So the volume was there. He produced, more efficiently than he's going to generally going forward on that volume, but still had a really nice underlying volume. Logan Thomas continues to look promising. I am getting a little bit concerned about his per target efficiency, but his targets are awesome. He was targeted on 25% of his routes this week after 26% last week. So consistently getting targeted. That's great to see. But yeah, his yards per target's like 3.7. It's really gross. And you could see maybe Steven Sims getting a little bit more involved if he can improve on that. it's not exactly the same slot receiver, tight end. I mean, they're different positions, but similar depth of target, and so you could start to see him losing some of that. But that's again, this yards per target, it's not sticky, and I'm mostly concerned about it when there's like an obvious option of a pivot that the team can make away from this guy. There isn't in this case. I mean, there's no real tight end competition. He's clearly locked up that tight end one role. I don't think we'll see his snaps get scaled back. So I'm not that concerned about the yards per target for now. It's something to keep an eye on going forward. If it doesn't pick up, I mean, it's so bad, 3.7. It doesn't pick up at all, then I do think they'll probably make some kind of change. But for now, I mean, he looks like he's still in the driver's seat to be this year's Darren Waller, and getting a really nice share of the offense and getting really efficient targets per his route. So we'll close with that. Make sure to check out Ship Chasing on Wednesday. We'll be going live around 9:15 and covering what was actually, despite a lot of injuries, and some terrible luck with Rojo in a great spot and everything that comes with that. It was actually a really good week for us in terms of the outcomes of our high stakes leagues. So we'll run through all of that and we'll get our waivers in. We have a system to get our waivers a little bit less stressful this week. So look forward to that. Look forward to us being able to talk through our teams without pulling our hair out. We'll see you